Hello, my name is Roger Watson and welcome to this session on the renal system. The renal system is comprised of the kidneys, and these are directly linked to the urinary bladder. The kidneys play a vital role in maintaining fluid volume and composition in the body and are thus a major regulator of the internal environment. In fact, they are referred to as the ultimate regulator of homeostasis. Before you begin, you may wish to look at this Bowmans Biology YouTube link on the urinary system. This diagram shows the basic plumbing, as it were, of the renal system. There are two kidneys, left and right. The left is slightly higher than the right. These are connected to the urinary bladder by ureters, and urine is expelled from the urinary bladder via the urethra. And this diagram adds a little bit more detail. You can see the ureters in the bladder and the urethra there, but in addition we've got the major blood vessels serving the kidneys. They're served by a branch of the aorta, and these branches are known as the renal artery, supplying blood to the kidneys, and the renal veins taking blood away from them. You can also see above them the adrenal glands. We already covered those in the lecture on the endocrine system. The kidneys lie retroperitoneally, in other words, they lie outside of the peritoneum at the back of the body. They lie in the abdomen but outside of the peritoneum. Here we see another diagram with slightly more detail. Here we've got a cross section of the kidney, and you can see it's made up of a cortex on the outside and a medulla on the inside, in an area called the calyx and an area called the pelvis, and these are the areas from which urine is collected and directed into the ureters. And here's just another monochrome diagram showing all the main structures, the major blood vessels, the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder and the urethra. And it also shows the sphincter on this diagram that controls exit of urine from the urethra. We'll come back to that later. So the kidneys are two paired organs situated in the retroperitoneum. They are supplied with blood by the renal arteries, which are directly linked to the aorta. 25% of cardiac output goes to the kidneys, and the gross anatomy of the kidney is composed of a cortex on the outside and the medulla, and each kidney has a ureter that connects it to the urinary bladder. This diagram shows how the veins and the artery enter the kidney at the pelvis. It shows the cortex on the outside and the medulla on the inside and the ureter. So the veins and the ureter are all closely linked at what's called the pelvis of the kidney. So how do the kidneys function? Well, the kidneys undertake three processes: filtration, secretion and reabsorption. These are all made possible by the microstructure of the kidney, which we will look at next. The microstructure of the kidney is that it's composed of nephrons which extend from the cortex into the medulla. This diagram shows a nephron, shows the medulla of the kidney, which is identified by the pyramid there, which is the structure in which the nephrons sit and which gathers urine, directs it towards the ureter. Shows there, doesn't show the cortex, but shows the capsule which surrounds the kidney, shows the area called the renal pelvis. The nephrons are intimately associated with blood vessels called the vasa recta. We'll look at these in the next diagram. So here you can see a nephron on the left shown enlarged from a section of the kidney surrounded by blood vessels. The labelling isn't present here, it doesn't matter, it just shows you the blue and the red blood vessels, which are diagrammatic to show the venous and the arterial supplies surrounding the nephron. So let's look at a nephron in more detail. Here you can see a nephron in blue, and it's been stretched out for clarity. At the left hand side you've got the Bowmans capsule, then close to it the proximal convoluted tubule, and furthest away from it the distal convoluted tubule, which is connected to the collecting duct which directs urine, which is the product of the kidneys, down into the renal pelvis. You can see that the Bowmans capsule is in the renal cortex, and the remainder of the structure is in the renal medulla. The two convoluted tubules are connected by the loop of Henle, which has got a descending limb and an ascending limb. In close proximity to this is the vasa recta, shown in red. These are the blood vessels associated with the nephron. There's a very specialised structure made up of capillaries in the Bowmans capsule called the glomerulus, and this is where fluid is exchanged from the blood into the nephron. The blood vessel carrying blood into the glomerulus is known as the afferent arteriole, and the one carrying it away is known as the efferent arteriole. At the top of each nephron in the cortex, therefore, there's a Bowmans capsule, and the Bowmans capsule contains the glomerulus. And this is just a diagrammatic representation of the Bowmans capsule. The Bowmans capsule is made up of epithelium connected to the proximal convoluted tubule on the right, and on the left you can see the distal convoluted tubule. This is not connected to the Bowmans capsule directly, this is just how the structure is folded up in the kidney. In red is the blood vessel forming the glomerulus, with an afferent arteriole taking blood into the Bowmans capsule and an efferent arteriole taking blood away, and you can see represented by the blue arrows the direction which fluid moves. So the first process in the kidney is glomerular filtration, and the glomerular epithelium is permeable to water but not to blood cells and to proteins, as shown in the next diagram. So this is slightly in more detail. Here you can see at the glomerulus, where the glomerulus is in close proximity to the Bowmans capsule, water, some nutrients, urea, pass into the Bowmans capsule. However, that water has to be reabsorbed, otherwise we lose too much water. You can see that process being shown there, where the second H2O has an arrow going back into the bloodstream. That's the reabsorption of the water. We'll look at that process later. So that's the process of filtration. Next we have the process of secretion, but what is this? Secretion takes place after reabsorption along the length of the nephron, and this is the deliberate movement of substances from the blood into the nephron, including hydrogen ions, potassium ions, ammonia, and drugs and toxins are also secreted in this way. These may not necessarily be moved into the nephron in sufficient quantities at the Bowmans capsule, so they are deliberately and actively secreted out into the urine. And next, reabsorption. Now, before we go any further, filtration, secretion and reabsorption take place simultaneously. However, they're presented in sequence because filtration takes place first at the glomerulus, then substances are deliberately secreted out into the glomerulus from the blood, and then substances have to be reabsorbed, and these include the majority of the water that's filtered at the glomerulus to prevent dehydration, also sugar, sodium, vitamins, nutrients and water. The process whereby water is reabsorbed into the bloodstream is quite complex and intricate. It's called a counter-current mechanism, and it's caused by the fact that water is continually reabsorbed from one side of the vasa recta into the other as the vasa recta descends down into the medulla. So the more the water is reabsorbed at the top and then the middle and the bottom, this creates a gradient of solute as you descend down into the medulla, and this is what allows this counter-current mechanism to take place. Note by looking at this that the flow of the water is from the top left out to the bottom right. And here we see what counter-current flow looks like at the bottom compared with concurrent flow. Imagine two tubes and there is solute concentrated at 100% in the bottom tube, shown here in red, and there's none at the top. As the two fluids flow in the same direction in the two tubes, assuming that they can exchange the solute or the water or whatever's being exchanged, because of the gradient you end up with the same concentration near the end of that system. There's nearly 50% in each as it reaches equilibrium. However, if you reverse the flow in one of those tubes, you strongly concentrate it at one end in both of those tubes to nearly 100%. And that's exactly what happens in a counter-current flow mechanism. Now, I have to say this is a difficult concept to grasp first time, and I would actually ask you to look up this perhaps on Google, somewhere else on the internet, until you're sure you understand how it happens. So that counter-current mechanism is how the concentration gradient is created and also maintained in the kidneys. Without that concentration gradient, the kidneys simply wouldn't function. And so this next diagram shows what happens to the nephron as a result of that concentration gradient within the kidney from the cortex down to the medulla. We are able to transport water out of the nephron. It ends up here in the interstitial fluids due to the increasing osmolarity as you descend into the medulla, but then it's taken away by the vasa recta. It's very complicated to show both of these systems alongside one another. So all of these processes working simultaneously, glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion, are what work to form urine. Urine is collected in the urinary bladder. So let's look at the structure and function of the urinary bladder. The bladder muscle is known as the detrusor muscle. And here's the urinary system in the male. And the bladder is located in the pelvis, and the outlet to the urethra through the penis is surrounded by the prostate gland, unique, of course, to men. Looking at that more abstractly, we can see that there are sphincters associated with this, an internal sphincter of smooth muscle and an external sphincter of skeletal muscle. The smooth muscle, of course, is not under voluntary control, and the external sphincter, which is skeletal muscle, is under voluntary control. So we can control the expulsion of urine from the bladder to a large extent, and this develops at about 2 years old and continues into adulthood, unless we have some specific problem which prevents us from doing that. And here's the urinary system in female. The one major difference is that the urethra in females is much shorter. This does make females more susceptible to urinary tract infections. Here's the female urinary bladder, and this is a section of a bladder which would be the same in males or females. We'll see an area there called the trigone, which is the area which lies between the entrance of the two ureters and the exit of the urethra. And again in women we have the same system with an internal urethral sphincter of smooth muscle and an external urethral sphincter of skeletal muscle. In women and in men this is known as the pelvic floor, and in women pelvic floor exercises can be deliberately used to strengthen what's known as the urogenital diaphragm to prevent urinary incontinence. After childbirth, for example, the pelvic floor becomes stretched and women become more susceptible to urinary incontinence, and they are shown how to do pelvic floor exercises afterwards. But pelvic floor exercises also work in men. One of the main things to be able to do in a pelvic floor exercise is to stop urinary flow midstream. If you can achieve that, then this shows that your pelvic floor muscles are in good working order. So let's look at the process of passing urine, which is known as micturition or urination. We're unable to control the bladder fully until we're about 2 years old because we can't inhibit the spinal reflexes. Now you'll have noticed in the structure of the bladder that it's convoluted with rugae. These are folds in the bladder which allow it to stretch. Now normally the bladder has about 50 to 60 mils of urine in it. We can't empty it completely, but this doesn't cause any problems. However, when the bladder fills to about 200 to 250 mils, the stretch receptors in the walls of the bladder send signals to the brain, and we sense that familiar feeling that tells us that the bladder is full. Sensory impulses as a result of that lead to relaxation of the internal smooth muscle sphincter over which we've no control. However, under normal circumstances in health, and if the bladder isn't allowed to get too full, we can then choose when it's convenient to relax the external sphincter and pass urine. There's an excellent animation of the micturition reflex. If you look for the micturition reflex at this YouTube link. So the renal system is comprised of the kidneys, and these are directly linked to the urinary bladder. The kidneys play a vital role in maintaining fluid volume and composition in the body and are thus a major regulator of the internal environment, so much so that they're referred to as the ultimate regulator of homeostasis. Next, some questions. 1. Describe the position and composition of the kidneys. 2. What vessels are attached to the kidneys? What fraction of the cardiac output goes to the kidneys? 3. What 3 functions does the kidney undertake and in what order? 4. What are the functional units of the kidneys? Name the regions of the functional unit. 5. Describe the glomerulus. Six, describe what happens at the glomerulus. 7. Name 4 things that are secreted into the nephron. Name 4 things that are reabsorbed into the blood at the nephron. 9. Describe the urinary bladder. What is the major difference in males and females? 10. Describe normal micturition. Now, I don't expect you to find all of the answers to those questions in the lecture. You can look up some of this material yourself on the internet. It might also help to look at my blog 4 Things About, a Simple Approach to Anatomy and Physiology, and look at the entry, the renal system. Thank you very much for listening.